All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Ryan Shih. I am a medical student at DGSOM, specifically in the MD PhD program. Right now, I am in the PhD 1 year, so that means I've done 2 years of preclinical work and have shifted to the PhD phase. And after sort of a long time in the lab, we'll go back onto the wards to revisit everything that I have forgotten over the last year or so. So I'm really excited to be here, though. I was asked to give a talk on the MCAT and how to succeed on a low budget. So that is going to be the focus for today. I think the general layout of this evening is going to be around 40-ish minutes for me giving like a workshop style, seminar style session. And then we'll have some time at the end, I guess 20-ish minutes for open Q&A. You can ask me anything and we'll just go from there. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and get started here. All right. I apologize. I could not figure out how to get my bottom taskbar to disappear, but hopefully everything else is visible as possible. All right. So yeah, so that's the focus for today, trying to succeed on a budget. I guess as a disclaimer, so I have taken the MCAT twice. And so I think I can speak from kind of a position of experience in what can and will go wrong, and then how to sort of switch things around and turn it to another sort of situation. So with that, I do want to mention a couple of sort of conflict of interest or disclaimers. So I don't receive any type of compensation at all for anything that I'll be describing today, resources or otherwise. So this is all just based on things that I've seen and am aware of. I don't have any particular conflicts of interest that I think would be warranted for a session like this. So nothing behind the scenes there. I did take the MCAT exam many years ago, so things have probably changed. Some of the content's probably been adjusted, although I think the general layout has been pretty constant after that 2015 change. But you know, I've made every effort to make sure that this deck is now updated to the most it possibly can. But if I do happen to miss something, always good to sort of double check and not take my word for golden truth and granted. Yeah, and everything here is also going to be based on sort of the lens of my experiences. So certainly if you see commonalities, definitely take things that you think would be useful to heart. But if you see something that might not be as applicable to you, you know, it's totally fine to take your own approach. Everybody's situation is going to be different. And then I will give a sort of modified version of this slide deck to Rami and the other coordinators, and then they can send it out to all of you. So no worries on trying to like take notes or screenshots or anything like that. All right. So as a kind of nerdy outline for this evening's talk, I think I've tried to describe all the different parameters that go into performing well on the MCAT exam. So I've given them as a function with these different parameters. One, of course, is going to be knowing what the exam structure is like. And this is actually an area that I can confidently say I missed the first time around. You'd think that I would have known exactly what I should be getting myself into, but that was not the case. So certainly you don't want to fall into a trap of not having that type of knowledge ahead of time. You also kind of have to be aware of what resources are available and which ones might be most useful for you. And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. Like everyone will probably have different sets of learning styles, different ways of assimilating information. And so it's going to be crucial to select the ones that would be most useful to your styles and habits. And then your schedule is going to be itself comprised of a number of parameters. One of those is going to be the content review that you conduct, whether that's through resources that are dedicated for MCAT or looking at your course materials, et cetera. There is some degree of discipline that goes into this. I think you all are looking at the pre-med track as a potential avenue for your future career. So you probably are already very much aware of what needs to go into a studying endeavor like this. Practice is the name of the game, especially as you reach closer and closer to the test date. And then one thing that is a little less commonly done, or at least done well, is analysis of that practice. So I'll be trying to go over each of these different elements, explore them a little bit, and certainly can go over any questions on them at the end. So to start with the knowledge of the exam structure, first, I do want to kind of do a little mini poll. I think we're trying to get a polling function set up, but it might be easier just to do either chat or reactions. So I am just sort of curious on what people's timeline is in terms of when the MCAT might be on the horizon. So maybe either in the chat or yes, yeah, maybe it would be easiest in the chat, just sort of describing like, are you looking at this summer, next summer, or maybe afterwards, like after a year, just to give me a sense of what the audience is. Okay, number this summer. All right, after next summer. Okay, got some mix. It's good. Okay. Yeah, so hopefully this will be useful for all of you. Certainly that's the goal here. But just if you're not already aware of what's on the MCAT, I'm just going to give a little brief outline of what it involves. So in the middle or the left here is going to be the traditional schedule. That is most likely going to be the test that you see. But I did give this talk 2 years ago, and at that time, COVID was raging in its full glory. And so they had an amended schedule that I've also supplied here in case something goes horribly, horribly wrong, and they will shift back to that style, which hopefully they won't. But the actual exam is comprised of a number of sections. You get a tutorial phase at the very beginning. It's optional. Most people will just sort of skip ahead because they've gotten a sense of what it's like to the practice test. You will have the first main section, which is going to be chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. It's about an hour and a half long, close to 60 questions. And then you get sort of an interleaved break afterwards. I will note that most of the breaks, actually, I think all of the breaks are optional in the sense that if you want to power straight through, all the more power to you. Of course, like take the breaks that you need. But you can take as much or as little of that break as possible, or as you would like. So you can stop at 2 minutes or take only a 2-minute break and then start the next section, or you can take the full 10-minute break. You can also take a 12-minute break if you want. The downside is going to be that the next section will start automatically for 2 minutes. So it's really going to be up to your particular timeline and what you think would be best for your testing situation. Afterwards is the dreaded CARS section. This is a lot of like reading comprehension and sort of passages that I think a lot of people find to be the bane of their existence in the exam. It's a little bit shorter in both time and number of questions, but it actually doesn't seem that way because you read a ton of passages. You have a longer break for lunch if you desire. Go into biological and biochemical foundations of systems, same outline as the first section, and then another break. And then something that was changed in 2015 was the addition of this sort of psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. And this reflects the trends in medicine of moving away from pure biomedical medicine in the sense like, okay, we're going to look at your vitals, we're going to look at your physical exam and then determine what's wrong with you, but to start encompassing other spheres of the patient experience, like their social interactions with others or their economic situation, et cetera. Because all of those things do factor into a person's health. And so this is one of the moves to start facilitating those types of conversations and mindsets early on. Last, this is actually incredibly important. There's a void question at the end. So you do have the options to, after taking this entire long test, to say, no, I don't want it scored. And this is one of the things you can do if you really think that things didn't go too well and you would not like it scored. One thing to note, though, is that every time you take the exam, whether it's voided from a score standpoint or not, it will count as one of your like year exams or your lifetime exams. And there's a limited number of times you can take the MCAT in a given year, in a given 2-year segment, and overall lifetime. But chances are most people will probably only take it 2 times at maximum, maybe 3, but generally the majority will be at 1. And so then there's a survey at the end, and this leads to a whopping 230 question exam with almost 7.5 hours of time if you take all of the breaks. If you do no breaks at all, it's going to be more like 6.5 hours, but nonetheless, a very long, a very grueling exam. So definitely something to prepare well for ahead of time. In terms of subject breakdown, this is a third-party estimate of the types of questions that you might see. So you can appreciate that there are a number of different fields that are going to show up. There is a pretty substantial chunk in the CARS section, so a lot of things that are based purely on reading comprehension, but you'll see things amongst the different sciences and psychology and sociology, and also sort of some of the intense elements of chemistry. Although, to be honest, after taking the MCAT, you're really not going to see too much organic chemistry in your life, again, unless that's something you'd like to do from a research standpoint. So I guess, silver lining. All right. So moving on to the next section in terms of resources, These can be divided up into two main categories. One is going to be the resources made by the AAMC, which is the company, conglomerate, corporation, whatever you want to call it, that is responsible for producing the MCAT and a lot of the other sort of medical application processes. And then there are third-party ones that are not endorsed directly by the AAMC as well. So going first into what the AAMC offers, these are some examples of things that you can either access for free or purchase online. One of the things that I find is actually very much underutilized are the content outlines. And so if you go onto their website, they actually will tell you exactly all of the material you are technically responsible for. They won't tell you the actual content itself, like they won't say, oh, you need to know these elements of photosynthesis, but photosynthesis itself will be something on that list. And so what can really help is either in the course or after you have completed your content review, you can go back to look at these outlines and see, are there any topics or words or phrases that come up that I'm not familiar with, or that I see and just have a visceral, like, oh my gosh, I hope I don't get a question on that reaction. And if those are the cases, then those are potentially things that would warrant some additional sort of exploration. There are the practice tests, and these are endorsed by AAMC. These are probably, or no, these are the absolute best resource.
It's not just me.
Generally, best ones. I have an internet connection unstable notification, so hopefully I didn't get cut off. But if I did, just essentially these two things on the left are the ones that I would recommend. Focus subject review can be a nice supplement, flashcards as well, but I think those are more going to be a case-by-case basis, whereas I think everyone should probably take advantage of these. Looking at it from a more zoomed out perspective, this is just a nice table that describes all the different things AAMC has to offer. They've sort of given some little characteristics on what things you might be interested in, if you like highlighting or strike through, etc. But overwhelmingly, the most useful things will be the practice exams for the reasons mentioned before. Looking outside of things offered by the AAMC, there are some third-party resources. So Khan Academy, I think, has been sort of like a really nebulous area because no one knew if they were going to switch it to like a subscription-based service or not. But I think it is still currently free. So definitely take advantage of that if you like having sort of those videos or practice passages and whatnot to go along with. QBanks are also a really nice resource, but generally speaking, the really good ones are ones that you have to pay for. And if you are able to derive your practice from other sources that are free, then I think it's not necessarily worth the investment. But again, case-by-case basis. Review books, I think this is one of the most common things that people do, mostly because it's like a nice, concise, in air quotes, a nice, concise compilation of all the different pieces of information you'll be responsible for. I think a big stressor for people is like, oh, do I need to get the most up-to-date book? Like it's 2022 right now. Do I need to get the 2022, 2023 edition? Answer, no, you don't. I think you can deal with ones that are like a couple years old because the content is not going to change drastically. And if you have concerns that a slightly older edition will not have material, then double check the content outlines themselves to see if there are any things that you didn't see in your content review that are on those outlines. But that being said, I think it's a little bit of a waste financially to shell out like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more for the most up-to-date books, because generally the things that they change the most are the graphics. They just like update colors or update like orientations and things. So it's really probably not worth it unless those graphics are really going to make a big difference for you. And then there are also courses that you've probably heard about. These are pretty intensive and pretty dedicated. Most of them are online, but there are a few that are in person. If you have the money for it and have the time for it and the willpower, go for it. But generally speaking, I would say that that's probably on a very expensive investment side of things. So out of the third-party resources, I would personally recommend these two. Get yourself a nice set of review books. You can usually find like an older pre-med or someone who's already been through the cycle and is then going to matriculate soon. Just ask them like, hey, do you have any extra books lying around? And sometimes they'll either give it to you for free or much cheaper than you would get for things like on the market. Something I did want to also mention, I guess there's no like perfect place to put this in the outline for this talk, but something to be aware of is the AAMC fee assistance program. And so eligibility criteria have actually been loosened a lot. It used to be the case that you had to have some sort of like citizenship or other particular documentation for this particular program. But right now they've just mentioned that you need a US-based address. If you're under the age of 26, you'll need to supply some parental financial information. And I think in some states, there are sort of like thresholds for household income by family size. But it's a very, very beneficial program to take advantage of if you qualify, because you get pretty much a ton of things for much cheaper or free. So you can take advantage of an entire like online bundle. So everything pretty much you saw on the double AAMC slides, those are, I think, pretty much waived for you. You have access to all of them. You also have access to the MSAR database, which if you're not familiar with it, it has information on like general stats of medical schools, rankings. There's sort of like research tracks, a bunch of like really, I guess, particular information about each school. It substantially reduces the MCAT registration fee, which is no small thing to consider. But probably the biggest benefit of all is that you get a waiver for the AMCAS fee itself and submission to up to 20 medical schools, which by like total cumulative cost is going to reach close to $1,000. So if you are sort of qualified for this, definitely pursue it and submit a request to get that. And I guess there are also some schools that are beginning to have new types of extra exams or whatnot. I'm not familiar with it, but I saw it on the site called Preview. So they will also sort of take like that and waive the cost as well. So something to be aware of, definitely. So moving on to schedule, as we've talked about the knowledge of the exam being important, you need to know what the structure is like, need to know what resources are available. Now it's kind of a matter of how are you going to use this information to guide your study. And so this is going to be comprised of many other parameters, but something that you can do is go online and say, oh, you know, what are existing schedules that either other people have done or that third-party websites have also done. And so there is one that's called Shamasian, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they'll have different like customizable options where you can like spit out a 3-month schedule or a 2-month schedule or a 1-month schedule. And they have them all laid out pretty much by what you're supposed to study on a given day, every week, for the amount of time that you want to study for. I personally think that this is not the route to go. This is a very cookie cutter approach, and I'd like to think that everybody's study habits are all going to be slightly different, even if there are like similarities. And so I think what is more beneficial is not to pick a schedule that someone has already made for you, but rather to develop your own schedule. And so in that process, I think it's useful to ask yourself a couple of questions and be very, very honest with yourself. And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity for additional audience engagement, if you so desire. All the numbers here are my signals for audience engagement. And so this is a set of questions I like to ask people, like, honestly with yourself, do you think that you have a long attention span, that you are a good test taker, you have a pretty solid foundation in the material that you're aware of is on the MCAT, and not really have any other major things on your plate during your study period? Just sort of like spitballing, if you're comfortable, throwing either a yes, I have all 4 of these, or a no, 1 or more of them is not the case in the chat, just to sort of get a sense of what people feel. Yeah, so there's a reason I did this, actually. So I think a lot of people have a sort of like, there's a myth that like, oh my gosh, like every pre-med has all of these things and like I'm the odd one out. And it's really not the case. Usually it's very hard. I'm very hard pressed to find someone who can confidently say like yes to all of these things. And so my kind of rule of thumb and heuristic is to sort of take up an approach where if you have all 4 of those things, great, you can sort of pursue an abridged schedule. But if 1 or more of them are maybe a no or a little bit iffy, then it's wise to consider maybe a slightly longer study period. And so this is based on my personal experience. When I took the MCAT the first time around, I studied full-time for a grand total of 2 weeks, which is not the way to go. I was studying sort of like part-time for roughly 3 months, but it was not anywhere near what it should be. I had sort of full-time research on my plate. I was part of a student group leading it for the first time as well, which took a lot of time. And there was just some other stuff going on as well. So I think it's really important to consider your own timeline and what amount of review would be most useful for you. Another thing that people also consider when making a schedule is when to put their diagnostic tests. And so there's a full length test that a lot of people like to use. It's like, okay, I'm going to take this without doing any content review just to see where I am at. Maybe it's a little bit of a hot take, but on my side of things, I think that's kind of a waste of a full length test. These full length tests are so important for getting practice on timing that to use one before you've done any content review is, to me, a waste. So I would personally recommend doing maybe some diagnostic passages, either on Khan Academy or some of the other websites out there, and just sort of get a sense like, okay, is it nice from a time standpoint, or am I getting things correctly? Do I feel rushed? Do I feel like I'm not understanding the process, or are the questions worded kind of weirdly? Sort of get acclimated to how the test is organized before you take a full length test without doing any content review. So I won't I won't beat that to death anymore. But generally, my approach is then to do the practice tests spaced by at least a week and use that towards the tail end of your study period. So I ended up doing, I think, 5 or 6 practice tests, and I took them every weekend, with the last weekend being my actual exam. And so I would take it on a Saturday, rest the rest of the Saturday because no one feels good after taking a full-length MCAT exam. On Sunday, I spent a ton of time to review it and then sort of use the rest of the week to either catch up on material, do any review that I deem necessary from that practice test, or sort of refresh on some of the content that might be a little rusty. So we'll get into that a little bit more in some of the later parts of the talk, but definitely something to consider is when your practice tests are, how much time you give yourself between them, and when to sort of decide that you are ready to take that full test, or maybe there might be like a postponement warranted. So that was a lot on scheduling. There are tons of more like minute details that can be fleshed out there, but I think that's more of an individual basis thing. And so to move on a little bit, we'll go into some of the content foundation strategies that one can use to do pretty well. And so these are some tips that are a little bit more general. You can apply them to your classes or whatnot. I hear that it's a midterm season, so if these are things that you would find useful for that as well, go for it. But things to really attempt to do as you're learning is to pursue an active style. I think another thing I did wrong the first time around was passive learning, in a sense like, oh, I'm going to read a chapter every single day. And after reading that chapter, I felt accomplished that I had gotten through one of the 12 chapters in that book. And by the end of 12 days, I had finished 1/7 of the review books. But the question that I failed to answer to myself was, did I actually learn the material in that chapter? And so taking an active stance as opposed to just using that checkbox of, oh, yep, read that chapter, using strategies like forcing yourself to recall things. Some people like a story time approach where you kind of have to summarize out loud what you just read about. I know some people who like doing self-imposed Q&A sessions, or even to write their own topic outlines. So those are all ways that you can sort of translate the material that you've just read or heard or seen and put it into a more digestible format for you. Another thing is to use images. This might cater more towards the visual and spatial learners out there, but sometimes if you are able to leverage those particular modalities, it can be very useful to take a little bit of extra time to make something that you can then refer to in future like refresh sessions. I am not the best visual learner, so this might not work as well for me, but if you are, definitely something to consider. ID triggers is also another thing. So I think one of the I guess misconceptions about the MCAT exam is that you have to be like on par and solid on all of your content. Like you just have to know everything down pat. And that's actually not true. The exam certainly does leverage or rely on your understanding of knowledge, like bits and facts and recall, but there's a very substantial synthesis component and active sort of like dynamic comprehension that is required in order to leverage all of that knowledge. And I would hazard to say, actually, like if you had to pick one or the other, either like a really good knowledge base that you can draw on for recall, or the ability to synthesize things as you're reading, the latter is actually much more important for scoring well in the MCAT. So I think like either as you're studying or before you start, definitely try to get yourself in a mindset that you don't need to know all the little details. The more you are able to recall, the better, because sometimes they're discrete questions. But if you're able to situate things and information within a larger picture, you'll find that you're going to be able to recall it better and apply it to newer situations better. And so flowcharts are one example to do that, but there are tons of other things like memory palaces, etc. Being efficient goes without saying. I think a lot of us like to spend time on the topics we enjoy. So I did engineering double major in undergrad, and so I was very attached to physics. Like I wanted to review nothing but physics. Needless to say, my life science background was very weak. And so when I came to review biology, biochemistry, and my almost non-existent social sciences background, I wanted to put it off. And that's really not the approach. You should take the reverse. Spend more time on the things that are difficult because they're difficult. So it kind of goes without saying. Memory devices are also useful. I don't have the mind that is able to leverage these to their full potential, but some people are able to like have massive mnemonics or puns that they can just get everything out. So these are just some examples of things that you can use, and sometimes it's a combination of things that is best. And so what I'd like to do now is do a little bit of an exercise. We just discussed strategies that you can use when you're reading a passage. And I guess something I failed to mention earlier on is that the types of questions you will see on the exam are divided into two. There are things called discrete questions, which are entirely standalone. You don't have to read a passage. It's just like the basic question stem, and you get answers in multiple choice. But there are also passage-based questions where you read a passage, and then there are probably like, say, 4 or 5 questions that are associated with the passage. Some of those questions are directly related to the passage. Some of them are indirectly related and require outside synthesis. And some of them, they're pretty much discrete, but just sort of lumped in with the rest of them. And so what I'd like to do here is kind of do a brief exercise on more passage-based questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw up a very small paragraph that I've written. Maybe we can take a couple of minutes to read it, give yourself maybe 2 reads maximum, and see what you can get out of it. So go for it. So I guess we'll just draw some beams. Does this look like what you have in mind?
I had the middle beam like offset because I think I remember it saying it wasn't fully in the middle.
Yeah, good catch, good catch. So it's actually going to be something closer to like this. Nice, good catch. Cool. Anyone know the color conventions used for voltages in physics and electrical engineering? Like high versus low at all? Oh, in the chat. Nope. Yeah, it's been a while for me too. Yeah, so red is generally considered to be like high voltage, and then black is considered to be low voltage or like ground. So this is something that like after reading, this might be the image that pops up into your head. And sometimes it's really nice to just take a moment and create a conceptual outline of things from this standpoint so that you're able to frame all of the questions in the future. So now that we have this sort of spatial thing in our minds, here, so we've gone through that. Let's revisit that same question. And now if people have any choices that stick out to them based on that discussion, go for it. Oh, no brave souls. Okay, yeah, no, I honestly, like, this is a question. Oh, I feel like it is A or B. Yes, it is either A or B. Why do you say you think it's A or B? Are there any?
I vaguely remember electrical fields being perpendicular, but I'm not sure.
Nice, nice, yeah. Yeah, when you have electrically charged plates, the field is definitely perpendicular to that plate. So good recall. B, because the right-hand rule, so if the volts are parallel, then the electric field is perpendicular. So it is in the perpendicular aspect, but then now it depends on the voltage. Maybe A, but definitely F. Yes, it's very common to feel F in this moment. But yeah, so the correct answer is actually A. And so just as a brief thing, if you happen to get an electrical field question on the MCAT, now you're going to ace it because we're going to go through it right now. A memory sort of device that I like to use is think of a plus sign and then think of a minus sign. the plus sign looks like things are just like spitting out of it, whereas the minus sign doesn't look like things are really spitting out of it. And so the electric field is always going to go from positive to negative. And so when you draw your electric field lines between a beam that's positive and a beam that's negative, they're always going to be going perpendicular between those beams from the positive to the negative. And so we said that the outer beams were the 50-volt ones and the inner beam was the 0-volt ones. So that's how we arrived at this perpendicular to the axes from the outer beams to the inner beams. So really nice job, all of you. But this is an example of a question that you might get, not on this particular subject because that's not on the content outlines, but this is where you have to synthesize information that you know from the outside, but also take information from the passage and put it all together. And so that's a skill that you kind of have to develop, particularly for the MCAT, because it does it in a way unlike any other test out there. So that's where practice is so important. This is another question. Maybe for sake of time, we won't go through it, but this is another instance where you'd have to take information from both the passage and knowledge of sort of like your own recall. And so it's asking you to envision the entire system like on an XY plane. You have the beams sort of positioned upwards like we drew them. And then if we were to put an electron between any two of those beams, where would it go? And so we said that the electric field goes from positive to negative. And so if we were to take a positive particle and put it in that space, it would also go from positive to negative. But because we know an electron is actually a negatively charged particle, it's going to go in the opposite direction. And so in this particular instance, we would be going from low voltage to high voltage, which would be toward the outer beam of the pair, whichever one it is. So happy to talk about that further if people like, but for sake of time, I'll just sort of move on. And if you are like, what the heck, I can't picture this at all, this is what the actual device looks like. And so this is from my undergrad research, really nice engineering device, but it does this kind of weird little like kind of thing when you put different voltages on it. So just a little bit of a fun fact in video to break up hopefully what is not a monotonous talk. All right, so we went through some of the content foundation strategies. Now I'll breeze through a couple of things on discipline. I think some of the biggest pitfalls that people can run into when studying for this exam comes to length. And so a lot of people think like, oh, you know, I've been doing my undergrad classes, I took all the prereqs, I don't need to spend 3 months on prep time. And you might not. Like, again, these are always going to be case-by-case situations. But really don't underestimate this exam because it is unlike any exam you have taken. It's not like the SAT, it's not like the ACT, it's entirely different. And it's much better to give yourself extra room and feel comfortable than have to keep postponing, keep canceling, or worse, cancel. And not only is it going to be stressful from a mental side of things, it also is going to be financially not in your interest as well. So this is kind of like a little table outlining what happens when you either reschedule or cancel X number of days before the exam. And so if you're 2 months or more out, it's usually going to be pretty cheap from a rescheduling fee, and you'll get a larger refund. But as you get closer and closer to it, that reschedule fee goes up and your cancellation refund goes down. So in your best interest to not underestimate the time that you want to take. Other things are to make excessively rigid schedules. This was a mistake I made for actually studying for my step 1 board exam in medical school. I studied from 6 a.m. to 12 midnight every day for 7 weeks, and that was not a healthy lifestyle, so don't do that. I am an example of things not to do, so don't do that. Give yourself breaks, include flexibility, give yourself buffers for sometimes, you know, you want to get through a passage in a day, but, you know, it just doesn't happen. So give yourself those buffers. Routine is also good too. A lot of people sometimes from their college schedules have haphazard study times. For MCAT, it's a little bit better to shoot for consistency. And I guess like an associated note here would be to train yourself to study in the time that your brain is going to be active for the actual test. I think a lot of us in undergrad study at nights, just because, you know, classes during the day, extracurriculars, etc. But most of you would be taking the exam in sort of like the morning / I guess early afternoon of the day. So it's best to train yourself to be sort of up and at them at those times too. Subject burnout is very real. I think there are so many subjects we have to be responsible for this exam, but, you know, another way to go about it is to train yourself for the amount of time that you'd have to spend on the actual test, which, remember, there was like 90 minutes for cars and 95 minutes for the other sections. So keeping yourself to maybe like 1.5 hour increments can be a nice strategy to not only prevent your mind from turning to mush, but also allow yourself to sort of train subconsciously for the subject timing. This goes with the first one. It's good to take some breaks, not too many, but some breaks. It can help you be efficient and focused. And certainly staying productive and disciplined and motivated are all things that are important. And so strategies here are, have a healthy amount of fear for the test. I think some people have an unhealthy amount of fear, like it's a very big endeavor. So definitely try to rein that back a little bit. And something that people usually don't have as much of is the amount of confidence in themselves. So you have been doing amazing things the past several years, whether you're a freshman or a senior or an alumnus. You are at UCLA, one of the premier institutions in this nation. And so I think that, reminding yourself of all your accomplishments is an excellent way to sort of boost your confidence and, keep track of the things and your abilities. If you run into those moments of being discouraged and whatnot, a really nice way is to remind yourself why you're doing this to begin with. And so that can be, from an effectiveness standpoint, doing drafts for your personal statement, or finding patient stories and recalling the interactions that you've had that have inspired you to pursue this pathway. Of course, work hard and play hard. When you take breaks, take actual breaks. Don't be like me and feel like you're wasting time by taking a break and don't actually enjoy that time. Take your breaks, enjoy it, do something fun, go out with friends, whatever your break time looks like. And certainly everything is just about balance. So try to keep things in balance. All right, we're gonna kind of zoom a little bit because I'm running over already, but I think these are actually the most important bits of the talk. So practice is obscenely important. I guess, so this is where the discrete questions, I described this earlier, so I'll go over that. There are mock passages that are interspersed as well. The non-AAMC practice tests are useful tools. I would say if you had to choose when to do them, do these before you take AAMC practice tests, because remember, those official practice tests are going to be the closest thing to the real thing. So take these non-endorsed practice tests as maybe your diagnostics or as the sort of the earlier ones in your review. Like I just said, the practice exams are going to be the more important ones. So I found spacing them by week was enough where I didn't feel burned out, but I was still getting sort of a nice review every week. I would recommend taking them under time test conditions. You do have the option to take them under extended or untimed, but I think those are really not realistic. And so it's useful to just sort of get yourself from the get-go adjusted to what the schedule is going to be like. One strategy that I actually recommended to a student who is having difficulties sort of moving from subject to subject is that use the breaks as reset points. So when you're done with that chemistry and physics section, the first one, and you're moving into cars, take a moment during that break to remind yourself, we're entering a new section here. Whatever happened in the previous section, I can't change it, so let's reset and let's get our game on. And she found that to be really helpful and scored really well. All right. So to the last section of the talk, apologies for going over again, but this is really important. Everyone focus. If you take nothing else from this talk, this is the single slide that I want you to pay attention to. And so maybe just read this to yourself a couple of times. This is really important. Yeah, so repetition is really, really important. And to read this out loud for that repetition, you should spend as much and probably more time analyzing your practice exam as you did actually taking it. So remember, the exam itself is 7.5 hours long if you take all of the breaks. So chances are you'll probably take somewhere between 7 to 7.5 hours to take the exam. That means that when it comes time to look at the results from that practice test, that you spend at least 7 hours analyzing it. And a strategy I found useful is actually to spend a whole day doing it. Everyone's going to be different in that regard. They'll move at different paces. But really, it's so important to use this exam to its full potential because not enough people do. And so what do I mean by that? This analysis can be very in-depth. And so this is a screenshot of a sort of spreadsheet that I set up that I found to be really useful. My second time around, I didn't do this the first time around. So highly recommend that you do this from the get-go. But most people organize something similar to this, but they don't have as many columns. They'll have this first column, which is, was this question answered correctly? And based on, this is just a binary system, so 0 is incorrect, 1 is correct. They'll say, if I got it incorrect, I'm going to flag it for review. Something that a lot of people don't do is then look at their confidence level when answering that question. So if I based my review only on the questions that I got wrong, I would have done number 5, number 15, number 22, and 32 out of these first 33 questions. You can see that I was actually not so confident about some of the ones that I did get correctly. So number 8, for example, I was just shooting for the stars. Like I didn't know what was going on and just took a random guess, but still got it right. So if I was only looking at accuracy, I would have missed that topic, which would have been really important to review. And something that kind of goes along with this is the number of choices that you're guessing between. And so I found it very useful to keep track of this information, because not only does it give you a sense of how many things you were sort of very confident about, less confident about, or just totally guessing at random, but you can also derive some stats about yourself and how well you do. So just looking at this information, a very interesting pattern is that when I did not get the question correct and I was not confident at all, I was usually guessing between only two answers, not 4, not 3, but 2. Shows up in 15, shows up in 22 as well. So what that tells me is that when I was getting questions wrong and I was not confident, it was because I was hedging between 2 answers and I would always pick the wrong one. And so what this can do is it can tell you a heuristic, or when you're taking the exam and you find yourself in that situation, okay, what's my gut reaction? I want to choose this answer. Well, if my track record is I usually get it wrong, then maybe as a test taking tip, go for the other one. So this is an example of information that you can take away from the analysis that most people won't get. And that's going to make a huge difference in the score. Topic and review columns are usually things that people keep track of. But the one thing that I think made the difference for me between my first test and the second test was this last column here. I'll try to wrap up in the next minute or so. I don't know if I mentioned it in the beginning, but I moved from a 513 on my first exam to a 521 on my second exam. So that's going from about an 85 or 86 percentile score to a 99 percentile score. And I will fully admit that that second time around had luck involved. I got a perfect on the psychology section, which was arguably my weakest one out of them all. So definitely lucky. But something that I think made a huge difference in that score increase was this column. And so to explain what this is that this is a categorization of the question type. Not the content of the question, not the subject matter, but the type of the question and how it's worded. And so you can see on the right here that I've made little legends about what the question is going to be. So R stands for, say, basic recall, for example. So this might have been a discrete question that just asked me to remember something, a factoid. But something that I found myself missing a very high proportion of the time in the car section was actually A, for author. Almost without fail, whenever there's a question that asks me to put myself in author's shoes, what is the author thinking? I would miss that question. And so with all of these other types of analyses, even if you did this confidence and guessing thing, you would never flag that there was a pattern in the wording of the question that was throwing you off, that was not related to the content itself. And so this is something that I would highly recommend you do. It's going to take more time to sort of build your key according to the things that you are able to sort of pick up on. But certainly something that I think can make a massive difference in scores. So I think with that, I have concluded all the bits. I'm 9 minutes over, so I apologize for that. But just as a recap for the things that we've discussed, we've talked about the importance of knowing what the exam content is, talked about the resources available, both officially endorsed and third party. We've talked about schedule and all the different factors that go into it, including content review itself and strategies to take, the discipline elements that go into it, making sure that you practice a lot, and then finally, and last but certainly not least, doing a thorough analysis of those practice exam results. So with that, I will thank all of you for listening. It's always really exciting for me to sort of talk about this kind of stuff. I really enjoy the mentorship. Thank you, Ramya, for sort of connecting me with all of you. Always a fun thing to do. I am part of the Med Mentors group, so I'd like to thank everyone there, as well as those in the UCLA Career Center and the pre-health office that we've collaborated with a lot. And the last plug I will give is that if you go onto our website and all these different links, you can get access to tons of different resources. We do one-on-one meetings where you can discuss anything you want. I think that's actually how Ramya and I met. You can do essay initiative to submit sort of drafts and get feedback on it from medical students. And then you can certainly keep track of our different social media channels to see when events are coming up or get recordings and all that kind of jazz. So with that, I will end the sort of workshop session and open it up for any open Q&A. I guess I will stop sharing as well.